Hi, welcome to today's panel. Really happy to be in a position to be able to host today's diversity, equity, inclusion panel. Before we get going, before I introduce everybody, just want to do a quick check to make sure everybody can hear us okay, see me okay. So if you could just put a thumbs up, comment or something like that. Remember, this is via StreamYard, so depending on where you are watching this, will see your comments, but we won't be able to see your name unless you give StreamYard permission. The other piece I need to mention, Facebook is having issues with StreamYard. So if you're watching through Facebook and the connection drops, please jump onto LinkedIn, for example, or jump on there now. So whatever works for you. So today's panel. Here's the thing. As an industry, we have a critical role to play in driving change from a DEI perspective. But before we can do that, we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves. What are our conscious and unconscious biases? In a world that's become so polarized, we need to make sure that every single voice is heard. Sometimes that means listening to people's fears, opinions that may challenge or may even clash with your own viewpoints. But here's the thing, just because somebody else has a different viewpoint doesn't automatically make them wrong. It means each and every one of us has a right to express our feelings, thoughts, fears, concerns. The reality is, until we look at DEI through another person's lens, we cannot truly create an inclusive workplace. Now, those of you that know and saw the poll that I had done, I was actually really surprised by some of the results. Now, I had over 10,000 views. And when I have that level of views, in the short period that I kept the poll open, I tend to get a lot of engagement. But what surprised me was the lack of engagement, I guess. And some of those numbers, just so you've got them, 20% of people felt that there's been significant progress made over the last year in their company or companies that they recruit for. 46% said modest progress, 27% said barely any change, and 7% actually felt it had gone backwards. Now, if that surprised me, what shocked me was the conversations that I had behind the scenes. People that actually rung me didn't actually vote, but picked up the phone, rung me, sent me an email, and so forth. And it was really shocking to hear some of the comments and how some people felt that they can't vote because their opinion isn't what others want to hear. And some of the conversations we had was around white privilege, and so forth. What I want to say right now, on behalf of myself and every single panelist, we want all voices to be heard. We're not here to solve all issues or challenges today. We're here to gain a better understanding of where things are today and how collectively we move forward. So please ask any question, share your feelings, thoughts, concerns. However, it must be respectful. And your comments must respect, each and every one of us must respect another person's right to be heard, because only then can you become part of the solution. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to today's panel. First of all, we have with us Carolyn, President, Randstad Technologies. We're also joined by Angelina, Senior Account Client Manager and DEI Leader for Brunel Energy North America. Chris, who is the DEI Leader for a global workforce solutions company. Last but not least, Roy, founder at Clark House Advisory Services. So before we get going, I'm sure most people know everybody on the panel, but Carolyn, if you just want to take a quick minute to let everybody know who you are.
Hello, everyone. Very pleased to be here today. It's such an honor to be part of such a great panel and to be discussing such an important topic. I've worked in the staffing industry for the last 14 and a half years in different capacities across general staffing, engineering, and now I head our IT practice at Randstad. Throughout that journey, I've been an advocate lifelong for women in leadership, but also as an ally, as a woman that I am, to support marginalized communities in the development there. I was really pleased to be offered the opportunity to step into the Chief Diversity Officer role in August, where we're committed to really driving change through action instead of just sitting from an awareness standpoint. So again, very pleased to be here, and I'll pass it over to Angelina.
Good morning. My name is Angelina, and I work for Brunel, which is a global staffing and recruitment agency. And I'm responsible for the life science vertical, primarily the pharmaceutical division. And I'm also responsible for leading the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd like to echo Carolyn's sentiments, where I'm very excited to be participating in today's panel discussion. It's imperative that we have these conversations. They're not always comfortable, but we're hoping by the end of today that there will be a lot of takeaways, and people are going to continue to have the dialogue. I'm very passionate about what it is that I do for a living, and that's helping people. Like I said, I work for the life science division, so the end user is a patient, but having that awareness about diversity, equity, and inclusion for marginalized communities has always been a passion of mine. And I'm just really excited to be here. So now I'm going to introduce Chris. I'll pass it on to you, Chris.
Thanks so much, Angelina. Welcome to the audience. Let me first say it's a pleasure to be here for all of you in the audience. Hope your families are healthy and well, and certainly looking forward to a great conversation today. Suki, I'd first want to reiterate, thank you. Thank you for your boldness. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for role modeling what these conversations can look like. It's such a needed topic, and I'm honored to be a part of today's dialogue. I always say you don't have to be, which means you don't have to be a DEI leader. You don't have to be a perceived expert. You don't have to be from an underrepresented or marginalized group, or to be a champion or ally in this space. And again, so thank you so much for curating this panel and providing an opportunity for dialogue. As you mentioned, I'm a DEI leader and have been for the past 5 years. I spent 13 years in the staffing industry, working for a fantastic company called Manpower Group, a leader in the world of work. And currently have started to do some consulting, working with a great company called Circa, who leads in the DEI and SaaS, software as a solution space. Lover of humanity. In my personal life, I've seen the richness and depth and complexity and color that diversity has brought to my life, and how it can be really powerful and transformative. And so, again, looking forward to today's dialogue and the healthy interaction and dialogue on a very powerful topic. And with that, I'll kick it over to Roy.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to introduce myself. I'm Roy Clark, the Managing Director of Clark House Human Capital. We're a global talent partner as well as a global advisory within human resources, human capital, and diversity and inclusion is a very important and very important subject, specifically within the context of our country. And it's been a passion of mine and my business for the last number of years, where we've unpacked, what diversity and inclusion means, and we advise clients on how to successfully put in diversity and inclusion strategies into businesses. It is an absolute passion of mine, and it's such a pleasure to share the stage with people who have exactly or very similar enthusiasm to this topic, and just to be able to have the conversations. That's the first step. So really looking forward to getting stuck into this, and I'm going to give it back to you, Suki. You're on mute.
I'm the one that stays on mute after all that. So let's get going. My first question is going to be to yourself, Roy. Ooh. Can you provide a definition of DEI and what the crucial differences between the three words are? Not only that, why is it so important that we have the proper language around this? And I've got a third part to that. What are some of the myths and barriers to diversity and inclusion?
Sure. So you keep putting me on the spot straight away. Look, I think for me, maybe I'll start at the first kind of section. Diversity and inclusion are often widely discussed, and they're very debated topics at the moment. But I do honestly believe they are not fully understood nor interpreted correctly. And that's why we often see diversity and inclusion programs fail. Your poll talks exactly to that. I mean, over 35%, barely any change or going backwards. I see diversity as this complex equation of human capital expressions, and it needs to be looked at holistically. And often it's just looked at one-dimensionally, or some sort of intervention or program that needs to be put out there. And most organizations are really grappling with how to view diversity and inclusion and equality, and underestimate the power that it can do to that organization if executed well. So in my mind, to answer the one part of your question, why do we need to understand the language of D&I? And I think, it reminds me of a quote Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. And I think when we create an opportunity for people to, set the scene where we can educate, enlighten, stir empathy, create that curiosity, and kind of get people to pay more attention to the language of diversity and inclusion. And it gives us an opportunity to then set a foundation, a common language, if we kind of understand the same concepts. And for me, when we're looking at beyond just common labels, associated in workplace, D&I, and, people get scared of that. And it allows people to start building the muscle to have the conversation. I think a big aspect, it starts to reduce fear, this kind of notion around what diversity and inclusion is. People get scared of it and they're like, well, that's some sort of HR word, and you know what I mean? And I think it starts creating a foundation for people to start talking, more openly about it. And, I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown, vulnerability. Chris talked about, you being bold and you're courageous and your vulnerability of coming out there. And I think it's fantastic. But I think she's got a very good part in her book called Braving the Wilderness. And she talks around, if we're going to have to sign up, join in, take a seat at the table. We're going to have to learn how to listen, have hard conversations, look for joy, share pain, and be more curious than defensive while seeking moments of togetherness. And I believe when we get to that component of having a common understanding of what diversity and inclusion means, I think it better equips us to have that understanding. So long way short or long way around, how do we define diversity? I mean, we can look at the kind of typical scientific or, dictionary version, where it's a range of human differences, it's included or not limited but to race, gender, generational, sexual orientation, age. It could be social class, physical ability or attributes, religious or ethnical values, all these kind of your national origin. These are really key components that, we could look at. But I like to think of diversity as a bit more simpler. I like to think of diversity as inviting anyone into your household. That for me is such a key thing, inviting people into your household. But if we're looking at inclusion, we need to understand that inviting people into your house doesn't mean that you're going to stick them in the back room somewhere and you never see them. Inclusion means you have them at your dinner table and you share stories, and that's where I see diversity and inclusion coming from. If we have to look at some of the myths, in my mind, I think, people often see diversity as some sort of destination, and it's some sort of like pink and fluffy, all roses and cupcakes, and it's not. Diversity is hard. People often look at diversity as there has to be a winner or a loser, and that's also a myth. There's no winner or loser in this. It's not about one wins or one doesn't. It's about abundance. I think we need to understand that there's differences, and differences are good. I think why the myths are that diversity inclusion is easily fixed with just fixing a culture or tweaking a culture, which is not a bad start, but I think, cultures are complex things. I think some of the other myths is D&I, people look at it, it's about a number thing, putting various people of color or race, into a certain environment. And so those are a couple of the myths in my mind. I mean, there's so many barriers to diversity and inclusion. And I think for me, one of the barriers is not knowing really what it means, where it sits, what's its strategic intent. We talked earlier, about allyship. There's little or no allyship. People aren't buying into this. How do we make it measurable? Other barriers would be things like microaggressions that go unchecked in organizations. There's a complete lack of role models. And again, one of the big barriers is there's just still so many vested interest and little or slow investment into D&I. Now, I'm not talking monetary investment. I'm talking, the commitment to get this going. The barriers are complex structures. These are pre-existing structures that go back, forever. And people love the idea of diversity and inclusion, which is a good thing, but you're trying to fit it into pre-existing structures and they don't work. Views are often narrow-based. And I think there's a lack of education to have this kind of dialogue. So hopefully not in too much of a long-winded way, Suki, I kind of touched on all 10 of your questions that you posed to me. No, I'm joking.
No, thank you ever so much for all of that. I got a follow-up for yourself, Chris, right? DI, it's a wide topic, as Roy said, and it means different things to different people. Perhaps you could talk about the value of DEI and what it means to you.
Yeah, thank you, Suki, and Roy. Thank you for setting the stage. I think so many of your points we will reiterate through this dialogue and discussion. Particularly for me, I loved when you mentioned inviting folks into your home. I heard a really powerful DEI practitioner once say, you can't be an effective DEI ally or champion if you don't lead a diverse life. And so it starts with each one of us taking up the charge and leaning in, in our personal lives to really drive this issue. But I also love to take something that is very complex and try as much as I can to simplify it, to digest it. And so for me, I'll start with what DEI means for me. For me, DEI really simplified down really just means difference. It's difference. It's the power and value of that difference, the richness, the color, the complexity in life of that difference, and how that leads to growth and creativity, both personally and professionally. So to me, the topic's not a scary word, and maybe that's because that's my role in what I did day to day. It means learning. It means growth. It means understanding. In this environment where we all pride ourselves on being learners, and the world is changing so rapidly, and there's terms like learnability, where we're continuing to learn skills and intellectually grow. This DEI is part of that overall journey. Again, I would iterate. It doesn't mean necessarily alignment or agreement on all issues. And so I think, we can take our debate hats off for a little bit. Sometimes that will come up, and there will be times to see how we can come to common ground and make progress. But for me, it's really just that difference and learning and growth. You talked a little bit about the practical definition, and certainly from a diversity side, I think it really means looking at who we are and our identity, both the physical characteristics and our abilities, and also our chosen characteristics. And then the equity, inclusion, and belonging side is how you harness that diversity in a productive way, ultimately looking to really increase fairness, which can lead to equality, or sometimes just creates opportunities for access and awareness and really being understood. Now, there is a component of it that involves some healthy tension. And Roy, I think you touched on it, and I think that's a realistic piece that leads to growth. Tension doesn't necessarily mean friction. It doesn't necessarily mean irritation. I was watching a YouTube video called Middle Ground, and it was a really powerful video where they bring individuals from different backgrounds and touch on tough topics. Again, not intended to solve, but intended to have a productive debate. And so I think, at the heart of diversity is that component, so that we all personally and professionally in our companies grow. When you look at the value or the importance of diversity, I think many of us have probably heard or seen the studies. Catalyst and McKinsey have come out with studies that show diversity leads to higher productivity, higher customer service, better innovation for companies. And so I think the business case for diversity has been well proven. But as you look at the landscape of our world and the changing world of work, I think it's really important for companies and for individuals to understand that this is becoming a business and personal imperative, this DEI journey. More and more we're seeing globalization. Soon we're going to have 5 generations in the workplace, all working together, all with different motivations and wants and needs and desires. We're becoming more connected, right? Through technology and social media. We're peering into people's lives and hearing their thoughts and what they value. We're seeing this blend of personal and professional coming together, this idea of one life and everything being integrated instead of segmented. And then, specifically for the staffing and recruiting industry, right? We talk so much about the skills gap and the talent gap and the rise of hiring intentions with the lack of talent out there. And so the necessity to tap into any and all pipelines is a necessity as well. And, again, not to mention kind of the social and political issues that are arising that is causing some polarization, amongst populations. And so when you look at all of that in totality, along with the pure value of it, I think there's a real imperative that we address this head on. I think it's only going to become more important in the future. And if we take the lens that this is a learning and growing discussion and not necessarily a condemning or debate discussion, I think it will be, incredibly, incredibly healthy. Suki, I believe you're a coach, and you talk to any executive coach or sports coach. Growth comes through tension. It comes through tension. That's where growth and development come. And so for ourselves individually, for our societies, for our communities, it's so important that we lean into this tension in a productive way to become better on the other side.
Those are some, incredible points, Chris. And I just wanted to pull into some of that discussion that you're having. And I love this concept around learning that we keep speaking to. And something to think about with growth specifically, learning something that maybe is not as complex or huge new skills doesn't take as much from an individual as completely getting a bit vulnerable around it. So I think when you think about ED&I, think about if I'm growing, it's going to feel uncomfortable, and be okay being vulnerable, right? And I think it's so important to be saying it's not about condemning anyone. It's not about judging someone, but how it will feel. I'll use it from a privileged perspective as being a white woman, right? Coming from the marginalized community as a woman, but coming from a place of privilege as a white woman. When I went through my own journey, I had a lot of shame that I felt through understanding what I didn't know. And that's okay, but understand that there's a community that's around. And now it's not just about proving the business case anymore. It's a responsibility of the private sectors, the public sectors towards humankind. And if we get this tailored right into our industry, think about equity as, how do I make sure that I meet people where they are? So you want to be able to widen your talent pool and attract people. And if you only go one way in one avenue and wonder why you're not seeing a diverse group of individuals apply, it's because you haven't taken the time to understand how to meet them where they are. And if I pull that definition piece for a minute, equity and equality get mixed up all the time. I hear that frequently. So equality is giving people the same thing with the same opportunity to access the position, for example. So put it into our industry, put it as a job description. It's written one way so that everybody sees it in one way. But that's actually not an act of equity, because we know, for example, put women in that place. If a job description says you must have 10 years of experience, often, and on the stats that we have with Randstad Canada, women who may have 5, 6, 7 will say, oh, I don't qualify. Yet if you put it on the position from a male perspective, if they have 4 years of experience, they're notably going to apply. And kudos to them for doing it, but women won't. So we need to be very careful on that. And that's that difference between equity and equality. So when you think of diversity and inclusion, the point that I wanted to bring into the discussion is diversity is about having everyone, you hear the proverbial table, right? So you have everyone coming in, you're bringing in the voices, you're really pulling people together, bringing a diverse opportunity for thought, right? It's not just about how we show up and who we are, it's how we actually think. We have diversity of thought. But inclusion is really around the sense of belonging at a company, right? So I'm going to use an example of Ramadan that's happening now. And even in my own case, I was holding a celebratory, we had a great first quarter, let's hold a celebratory lunch. Then I reflected to say, who's coming to the lunch? Realized members of the Muslim community were there, and we've changed it. So they're not participating. We're not holding the event to be inclusive to the team, to create a sense of belonging that when we're celebrating our success, we're doing it and meeting people where they are so we can all do it together. And just to maybe close on a comment, because I love quotes, and I don't know who said this. It is a diversity practitioner, but then it was someone else at a conference that added to it. And I love this because I also love to dance. But diversity is about being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And then this individual at one of the at a D&I, I think a conference, said, no, wait a minute, inclusion is actually being asked to plan the party in the first place. So completely different. I was like, whoa, it was mind-blowing for me on that perspective. But yeah, great discussion so far.
Thank you. Ange, do you have anything to add to this?
I think the panel has done an exceptional job in terms of articulating, what DEI actually means. I love Carolyn's, quote in terms of coming to the dance and yet not being asked to dance and being, part of the planning. And that's really imperative, is that everybody participate in the process. Like Chris said, it doesn't matter if you're at the leadership level, or if you're at the managerial level, or if you're non-managerial. It's really important that everybody play a role in creating an environment that is safe, that is inclusive, and also confidential. We have to have these conversations where people are feeling safe and they know that whatever they say is going to stay here. So
I totally agree with everyone. And it's Chris, you were saying earlier about me being brave to put this panel together. I mentioned earlier about how the conversations I'd had once the poll came out. I admit there was a point where I just thought to myself, oh, what have I done? And then then when I thought about it further, I thought, no, this conversation needs to happen. It just further solidified in my mind that this conversation needs to happen. So moving on, my next question is for yourself, Ange. We hear a lot here in Canada, companies looking for Canadian experience. Let's be honest, you can replace Canadian with English, German, French, American. Doesn't matter where it is, right? So again, I've got a two-part question for you. How can the staffing industry attract and build a diverse candidate pool that really does truly reflect the local workforce? And secondly, how do we as an industry ensure that we're actually representing and presenting all suitable candidates to our clients?
if you want to truly build a diverse talent pool, then your approach must be diverse as well. You need to take a pulse on your organization. Don't limit your definition of diverse. It's not just about gender. It's not just about race. It's not just about sexuality. There's always more you can do to be more inclusive and to celebrate new ways of thinking. Organizing, problem solving, you really need to decide what your outcomes you want to achieve. And so at Brunel, we're very conscious about posting vacancies in unlikely places. So we've aligned ourselves with communities that may have been ignored in the past. And when it comes to job ads, as Carolyn was saying, you need to be very intentional with the language that you use, that you're not ostracizing anybody from the process. So for instance, remove the language of he or she or heavy lifting. What else we found to be successful is encouraging referrals from our current employees. So specify what you're looking for in diverse applications, and you may want to give an opportunity to somebody who has a physical disability, but leveraging those relationships that you have internally. Diversity invites diversity. Another strategy is to remove any personal identifiable information from submitting applicants to reduce, gender, age, racism, any kind of bias. So, there's software out there that companies can invest in to ensure that the recruiters are not making assumptions. And that has been very successful. Another approach might be, the hiring committee, making sure that it's diverse panel because of the neurodiversity. Encourage them to check each other's biases throughout each stage of the recruitment. The more diverse the panel, the better it is. And then, of course, there's the mentoring, the coaching, and promoting diverse employees to higher positions. It's not enough just to invite them to the table. You have to, you have to massage them. You have to keep a pulse on what they're doing, ensuring that their onboarding is being successful, but walking with them throughout that journey. It's really, really, really important. And one thing that we do at Brunel is that we work with our candidates, our diverse, any candidate, but we want to set them up for success. So how do you do that? You create an environment whereby you're giving them advice, you're giving them the potential scenario of what that looks like when you're in a meeting with a client. How do you express your value proposition? That's really critical. The second part of your question was in relation to companies looking for that Canadian experience. So we have a relationship with an organization called Access Employment, and their demographics are people who are new to Canada. So they have a lot of professional skills. And so we do the coaching and we do the mentoring. And again, it's extracting what their value proposition is and leveraging what their experience has been. So my conversations with clients is, look, this person came from a war-torn country. They brought their family. They have to adjust to a new culture. Are you not telling me that this person is not agile? And just expressing and sharing that person's journey and the accomplishments that they had in their organization and the value that they can bring, and assisting that person, mentoring and coaching that person so that when they go into the interview that they are prepared for success. And then walking them throughout the journey. You can't just leave them alone. There has to be some succession planning. I think as an agency, we have the obligation to ensure that we are with them throughout their entire journey. And then you know what? That candidate becomes your next client. Not doing it for selfish reasons, but there's an added benefit there.
No, I totally agree. And I actually want to bring a question that I was sent earlier. And actually, I've had people ring me up and say, Suki, how do we handle this? And I've not known how to. Yep.
Can I just add on to that really quickly?
Go for it.
Because I think there were so many good points, and I just want to drive home this one of Angelina's points, and I think Carolyn, you mentioned this too in terms of meet the talent where they are. I am a huge proponent of what I call trusted advisors. I think so often organizations, kind of go with the post and pray approach. Making sure that, images are powerful, making sure that they have the right images and job descriptions are crafted. But what I have found really works in terms of accelerating progress, and again, Angelina, you mentioned this as well, is really working with those trusted community advisors. They may be affinity organizations, they may be community organizations, they may be religious institutions, they may be individuals in the community. But building that brand trust, really sharing kind of what your culture stands for, and not just when you're looking for talent through recruiting fairs or job fairs, but holistically understanding that population, what their motivations are, who they are, and partnering with that trust advisor in creative ways to get access to your brand and company is so powerful in terms of accelerating that relationship with different populations. And so just a really an add-on, but I want to drive that home because I feel like that is one of the keys that if you're looking to tap into new and different pipelines of talent that you have previously, that is sometimes it's a nuance that is sometimes missed, how to really creatively and in an in-depth way partner with those trusted advisors.
No, thank you for that. The question I was actually going to ask ties in. I've had so many people ring me up, staffing agency owners, saying our client is asking us for like tech, women in tech, right? They want to attract more women into tech, or racial diversity, whatever the case may be. And they're like, isn't that illegal? And they just don't know how to have that conversation. So maybe Carolyn, you could speak to that. So yes, we want to promote women in tech, but how does, especially in countries where it is illegal, how do you even go about, for lack of a better word, educating yourself and your client and ensuring that you are able to help elevate women in tech?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very common. And when we think about conversations, this comes up a lot, right? And I hear the phrase reverse discrimination, for example. So a really simplistic way to look at this that I hope you find comfort in is, as an organization, you want to reflect the community that you serve. And if you just think of what we're hearing on the panel now, right? That the power of storytelling, that you can't be what you can't see. And if you're in a new market and like use Vancouver's market versus Quebec City's market, the demographic of who you need to be internally is different. And if you're trying to be, one way, you're going to miss a whole opportunity of people. And what's so important about our industry, and listen, especially thinking in this recovery from the pandemic, we have a responsibility to really lean in to create a sustainable recovery. We can come back in and recover from the pandemic in a much more diverse way than how we exited. So go back to that conversation around just reflecting the community that you serve, and think of things like the federal contractors program, or a lot of our government institutions, crown corporations. You have to disclose your statistics to prove that you are a diverse employer. They're not on the inclusion side so much, but on that are you diverse? And they ask for the statistics and reflect their own statistics in Canada, right? Saying, hey, this is the Indigenous community. What is your membership in your organization from an Indigenous community? So if you can't be specific about creating equity and using equity to attract those individuals from the marginalized communities, how else are you going to get them there? So here's one thing I don't like is blind resumes. Why I don't is you should be intentional about D&I. And I think that's one of these major shifts, that instead of being so gray, meaning you have no opinion and no thoughts, and it doesn't matter where you are or who you are, talk to marginalized communities. They do have an identity. I have an identity as a woman. You have an identity, Chris, as a Black man, and you're proud of it. And we need to bring that forward. But it takes deep empathy. And deep empathy is about listening, but learning and really putting yourselves into people's shoes. And just to anchor over a bit to what Angelina was talking about, and Chris, what you were speaking to too, CEOs, we surveyed 800 CEOs and HR practitioners globally with our Work Monitor report with Randstad. The top 3 skills that they said they're looking for employees of the future is problem solving, empathy, and communication, and the ability to understand an agile workforce. I don't see any hard skills. I don't see any work experience. All of that's not coming up. We're in the revolution of reskilling and upskilling. So if we're there and you need to get into a marginalized community to tell them you have an opportunity now to lean in, how else do we do that without being intentional? So just be careful not to get stuck in that trap of not being intentional about it, right? You are in every other aspect in your lives. Why not be about that to attract marginalized communities so that you have a better representation of the community you serve at your company?
If I can make a comment or a question, Carolyn, in terms of removing any identifiable information from the resume, it's a challenging one because, by removing that information, sometimes it's giving somebody a seat at the table and you're able to articulate to the client the why behind the presentation. So it's automatically removing some of those biases. For instance, if somebody has a foreign name and it's very complicated, sometimes people are thinking, oh, well, they're going to have challenges articulating themselves, speaking the English language and so forth. And when we talk about identifying different members of the community, when speaking with a client, we also don't, if they're asking for a specific demographic, we still want to be inclusive of all individuals and present those candidates to the client and remove the names so that there's no way for them to identify if it's an African or if it's a South Asian or if it's a European. What advice do you have for that?
So I think, and great point, Angelina, and thank you for bringing it up. And I think this is bringing up a really important point in this whole area to begin with. If you're like Roy, how you opened, this is an ocean. D&I is an ocean and you can boil it. And there's lots of opinions on how to do things and there isn't as much expertise. Like, I don't know if you guys saw that when the pandemic hit and then, all of the social movements we have, all of a sudden, all these D&I positions from companies popped up. And it was like, I need someone with all this experience. And we're like, who are you getting that has all this experience? It's a smaller group of people. So I just want to put that out there. And I appreciate the difference in thought here on how to approach it. Because Angelina, the way that I think of this is it depends on the organization's ability to do that. If you go to an organization right now that has never screened or thought or looked that way, it is incredibly intimidating for them to say, I don't know who that is, I don't know this, and then half the time they back away, right? But I think organizations have to respect that they're at different levels. So if one organization does reflect the community that they serve well, I think they have more of an opportunity to expand, to use that approach, to remove identifying terms because they understand how to be inclusive and they're already diverse. But if they're just leading into that, I'll use women just as an example. Women in tech, it's a big thing. There's not a lot of women in tech and there's not a lot of women in tech who are leaders. And they're leaving, not because they're not confident and have the skills going in, but they are leaving because they do not feel that it's an inclusive environment for them to be in. So if they start with that whole recruitment and not understand who they need to be, why they, or how are they reflecting the community that they serve, do they have the right inclusive approach as a team? They do that too early, it actually could go backwards, both for the company and for the individual, if that person who is introduced and move through the system and that company doesn't understand inclusion. So that's, and again, an important part of this is my opinion of how I think it could work. And it's not to say that other opinions are wrong, right? And I think we talked about Suki that at the beginning. I think that's really important because the opinion that I have, and I can speak to Randstad's journey and where we're at within the industry, because there's a lot that we've been doing now, and we're not perfect and we're far from it, but we're moving the dial. We are making a difference in where we're going. I just think it's important that people understand, for anyone viewing in the audience, that it's okay that we look at things differently.
No, I appreciate your perspective for sure. I was just seeing if there's, different ways of approaching the situation where it's going to lead to success. So I understand that, different organizations are at different parts of their journey. It's, like you said, it's constantly evolving. Things are changing. There's so much uncertainties. What's the best way to tackle this?
If I could jump in there as well, and I mean, it's just the richness here is amazing. And Carolyn, you talked about those, those skills. As you said, there are no hard skills that are kind of out there. Agility, problem solving. I often get a question, what are the skills you would teach your children for the future? And I hope this comes across correctly, but I often say, and I stole this from somebody, and I said, teach your child to think like an immigrant. So someone who's arrived in a country with one bag, and you've got to hustle, get things right. And as a person who would be hiring, who do you want to hire? You want to hire people who have resilience, they're agile, they know how to hustle, they know how to survive. And I think people who are marginalized can bring that quite easily into an organization. Just back to the equity side, we have an Employment Equity Act in our country. We're celebrating 27 years of democracy. We actually had Freedom Day yesterday, which was a national public holiday. And I think, you know, I like the intentional part is, you know, we got to change stuff and we got to make stuff work. And I think where you, to Chris's point, a trusted advisor, you can talk to a client and go, this is who this person is, and be open about their race, their religion, who they are, where they've come from, because it's intentional. It's about making that difference. And I think we often also in our country get a lot of, it's reverse discrimination. It's, you know, we get this kind of thrown back. Oh, you know, I'm a white male. I'm going to lose my job because I'm a white male. Well, you know, I don't know. I disagree with that. I think people have to be more intentional about making that difference and getting those big wheels of change to actually start churning.
I want to add to that. Sorry, let me just add to something there. Two things that come to mind as you were speaking, Roy. In fact, as everybody's been speaking, yes, it's great as the recruiter dealing with external companies' job order. As an industry, as an environment, we're not creating an environment for them to feel comfortable in actually doing that. And let me explain what I mean here. We're chasing the dollar, right? So it's much easier to give the client what they asked for. So you're not consciously discriminating, but what you're saying is you're working closest to dollar. So you're just saying, okay, the client wants this, let me go and find that. And then there's the way the commissions are paid and all the rest of it. And I think as an industry, we have to start internally and helping our frontline staff actually be comfortable with this conversation. You guys, when I put this panel together, I said to you guys, I don't feel equipped to be able to talk fully and knowledgeably about this subject because it is so dumb. But I've gone out and educated myself with you guys. We've got to be giving our staff that opportunity. We've got to be ensuring that they feel comfortable walking away from a client, right? That's not aligned. So I think there's that disconnect. We have to, I'm not saying everybody has a disconnect, but I certainly think a lot of companies, staffing agencies have that disconnect. So if we want to change this story, want to have a different ending, and we want to contribute, we have to look internally first.
Yeah. I love the point around the reflect the community you serve. I think that was phenomenal. I've brought that up in previous discussions with Yusuke, where we talk about the demographic of our country and how you should be representing the demographic of our situation is slightly different. You know, we had a terrible past, and you know, where we need to get more of the majority population more included and more, you know, pushed into roles, and that's where we're coming from. But I think it needs to be, when you're representing CVs to your client on a trusted based advisory approach, you know, giving them the insights into people, but representing the demographic of your country or, you know, the community that you serve. Carolyn raised that. Carolyn.
So if I could just add, those conversations take place with the clients when possible. But when you have a portal, it's a whole different story. And until we evolve, it's still going to be a challenge.
And Angelina, I completely agree. And maybe there's an opportunity here to speak about our industry and our company. So if we think about embedding D&I into, as staffing businesses, into our business, because that's where I think the change will happen, is if our teams truly understand that no matter the format, what the client is asking for, if it's through an MSP, whatever it is, that they understand how to go to market to widen the talent pool, represent the talent, you know, that they have the skills, I think is important. And Suki, you brought up a good point. And I've heard this a number of times on panels that, oh, recruiters are just closest to the dollar. Well, why can't we be both? Why can't we be inclusively closest to the dollar? I don't think that that's a pipe dream. So if I think of Randstad Canada, okay, and the best story I can share is the story that we have, because it's our own story. I can't speak to someone else's story, right? We have lots that we can do to improve. We've won awards for how inclusive we are as an organization, et cetera. But when we go through and comb through all of the aspects of Randstad Canada, we're checking right now to ensure that every policy, approach, intake form, any training, etc., we're combing it to see that there's a marginalized viewpoint. So we've spoken about this a little bit. We need to have individuals with lived experience involved in creating our policies and how we approach things. So we're scanning everything to ensure we don't have the privileged lens only on it, and that we're looking holistically at it, and we have to evolve. So there could be, our team members from Randstad Canada right now sitting on here saying, I don't feel equipped yet as a recruiter. It's because at Randstad Canada, we're in a journey. And we've started that though, and created and tied our vision and our mission and embedded it into our business strategy. And this is a really big point for me, for everyone watching and any staffing agency that's there. How are you dealing with it yourself? Did you hire someone that's tucked in HR that's doing D&I alone? Do you have a reporting structure that goes to the CEO? Do you have a community, an office that's involved with it? Really understand what the structure is that you've set up. And it's important to be embedded into the business instead of a standalone, because where we've, talk about evolving, we've shared the statistics at the beginning. In the past, it was often a checkbox. Oh yeah, we did that initiative. We did unconscious bias training. Check, we're now an inclusive organization, right? So yeah. We've done lots of evolving there, but as staffing organizations, every individual who is an employee has an opportunity to choose to challenge. I love that hashtag choose to challenge that came out for Women's Day this year. It applies to so much. Is lean in and ask, what is our D&I strategy? What can I expect to grow for how I recruit talent? And there's a lot that has to happen. And I'm telling you, so many in our community, in our industry just aren't there yet. But if our industry takes this step, we are going to have compounding impact because we touch so many industries and we are this big gatekeeper to talent. So if we get this right and we make the commitments to change, then we're going to. And like I said, transparently, I don't know everything. By all means, I'm learning every day. We talked about lifelong learning. If people say, oh, give your expert opinion. Well, my expert opinion might have changed from what I learned yesterday from listening to a marginalized group tell me something I didn't know. And it's so different than I think anywhere else, like in accounting or payroll or what your sales approach, that often can stay more static, but this can't. But anyways, my point
being, I want to jump in on there though.
Yeah.
There's got to be severe accountability. Without giving any names, I'm going to give you guys an example of a global company. And I'm comparing the head of Canada with head of another country. Both are white males. Okay, so both have so-called white privilege. This company talks about diversity, inclusivity, all the rest of it. I have this individual on this side who truly, genuinely lives and breathes it, holds people accountable, etc., etc. On this side, you have the counterpart returning profits, right? But not even discussing it, and you see the blatant, for lack of a better word, biases, discrimination, call it what you like. So you have within one company, you have two powerful executives handling it very, very differently, yet the company has their initiative. So I think there's got to be an accountability for each executive as well. Board level members, they've got to hold each other accountable. There's got to be somebody that truly looks at it globally or nationally, depending on the size of your company, and says, no, I'm enforcing this and I'm making sure the Canadian president does it, or the American, or wherever. Everybody is held accountable, because only then are we going to get change.
Yeah, to Carolyn's point, it has to be, ingrained in the company's fabric, or, it's not going to succeed. It's imperative.
Yep. So moving on, Chris, I have a question for you.
And I will say, Suki, I think we're starting to see that curve shift a little bit. If you look at some of the statements from, investor organizations, some of the focus on ESG holistically, and some of the pressures on boards and organizations, not only to return profits, but to also be positive contributors to society. I think that some of that external pressure, be it governmental or investors, is starting to happen. And then again, I think with additional perspectives and some of the movement cultural shifts that we discussed earlier, I think there's an expectation of employees as well. And so I'm hopeful that some of that accountability will be heightened, and the response of that will be positive. But you are absolutely spot on. I think it starts with leadership first, and looking internally first, and really having your own mindset lens change before you start to get into the strategy piece.
Yeah. So before I get onto the question, I just want to read out a comment. As an immigrant, here you go. As an immigrant myself and someone who's experienced a hard time finding my first job due to lack, I would like to point out the importance of responsibility we have as leaders. Absolutely. It is that's why I started this whole conversation with, as an industry, we can truly drive this change. So Chris, my question for yourself, with your experience overseeing the Manpower Group's DEI strategy across all lines of business, everybody knows Manpower, like 80 countries, has given you a truly global perspective. What is the best piece of advice for getting started with or accelerating a DEI strategy?
Yeah, I'm smiling. There's so much richness and dialogue in this conversation that I think some of these will amplify statements that were already suggested. But I'll say three, and I'll try to make them theoretical and maybe a little bit practical as well. So the first one is start with yourself first, and make sure that you have that change in mindset. It's been proven and shown that leadership drives culture. Leadership sets the tone, and so I think it's up to the leaders in the organization, if this is a priority, to really take a good look at themselves and challenge their thinking, and make sure that they're committed before we get to the strategy piece. But before we start building out the actions and objectives and outcomes, to really have a hard heart check to really drive some of this. And I know, with prior organizations, especially with some of the events of last year, having that dialogue in multiple forums, family style chats, small intimate settings where people can be open and aren't scared of kind of the social repercussions of comments made or not saying things perfectly, were really profound and powerful in that, along with kind of panel discussions and public setting forums as well. So I would say, with any time I've seen really true accelerated progress, to your point around the two CEOs, it's been that a leader has really had that heart shift change. They may have had a partner or a daughter or a friend who challenged their thinking, their perception, their perception of norms, and really challenged their identity in terms of them being an ambassador and leader, and how they view whatever dimension of diversity or whatever other group or marginalized group we're talking about. So I would say start there. Before you can take a stand, you first have to take a seat. You have to listen and learn. The second piece, and Caroline mentioned it, is just be intentional. I couldn't agree with that more. And there is again, back to this point around tension, there is a natural tension between being intentional enough to actually drive progress versus it feeling uninclusive. And I would say there's no perfect way to navigate that. But what I have seen work, and actually what I've done in my prior experience working for a multinational company, is that we realized that if we really were going to make progress, we had to look at specific dimensions we wanted to drive, specific areas where there was pain points or gaps, be it development, be it the hiring, be it succession, and get really intentional about how and where we're going to drive progress. And so the way we did that in a inclusive way, yet intentional way, is that we had a goal globally, which was around gender and gender related to leadership, and making sure from a succession and leadership perspective, we were bringing more women into the organization and developing them into leadership roles. But then across our largest markets, we had a secondary goal that was based on cultural landscape, political landscape, based on that specific business and what the needs for that business were, and again, kind of where the pain points were. So holistically, we're tapping into various dimensions of diversity, different abilities, sexual orientation, gender identity, race, cultural diversity, veterans. But as it relates to the different countries and our different segments of the business, there was some real intentionality about how we were driving that forward. So my second, key piece was be intentional. So often I think people have that mindset shift and they get charged up and they're ready to go, and then they try to boil the ocean, and you end up with very surface level efforts that don't really drive any impact. And you start to prioritize activity instead of impact. And the third is an idea, Carolyn, I think very similar to what you stated. I called it, or we called it, conscious inclusion, and it's the thought that moving from unconscious bias to really starting to embed the desire, appetite, and ability to think consciously in all aspects of the business. So that DEI does not just become a programmatic issue in one particular area. I don't like the word audit, but really looking at how all of our people practices impact this strategy, and starting to embed with a open and creative and outside the box mindset on how we're going to look at embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion into each one of those areas. And, to the point I already mentioned, all of those functions or groups may not have diverse perspectives. And so that's okay. There has to be ways to pull that in. But I will also say, again, you don't have to be to be. And our companies and ourselves are made up of very intelligent and thoughtful and creative individuals. And if we put our mind to it, we can find a way to do both and ampersand, right? To drive to the bottom line and think outside the box and be more inclusive. And so making that a part of succession, making that a part of development, making that a part of recruitment, outreach, attraction, like we mentioned with the trusted advisors, consciously starting to embed that and realizing that, if we're going to do it, this really is a business strategy that will ultimately lead to growth was kind of that third component.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And as you were talking, we hear the saying, companies are putting profits before people, and they need to put people before profit. The reality is, if you do this, the profit's going to come itself. And what I want to add to what you're saying there for anybody that's listening is hold those leaders accountable, even if they are profitable leaders. If they are not practicing this themselves, then I question what they're doing in your business, why they've got a seat at that table. And it's probably because they're making profit. And that's where we've got to start challenging some of those thoughts. But Roy, I want to bring you in here. You've been involved in some real heavy research companies around the world. What are some of the leadership lessons and messages you can share with us?
Sure. I tell you, this research, and to Carolyn's point, your knowledge changes and your perceptions change all the time. You 1 minute you're thinking this direction, the next minute you're thinking this direction. So that the research has been really, really interesting. We've interviewed numerous people from different ethnical backgrounds, religious backgrounds, all South African, because we're looking at it from a South African context. Some of these South Africans are living overseas and abroad. And, different levels of leadership all the way to executive, and really asking a simple question: what advice can we give to leaders to better unpack, much more holistic and sustainable diversity inclusion strategies? What do we need? What advice can we give? And I've worked very closely with a phenomenal lady by the name of Liesl Beb McKay. She was one of the drivers of the Athena project, which was an initiative to drive women in banking within South Africa. And just, such rich stories and advice coming out. And I think for me, there's one particular story I'd love to tell you offline. It's quite hilarious. But to Chris's point, what we found a lot of is people started with themselves. So they started with the education within themselves. They started looking internally first. They started understanding that they could be the perpetrator. They could be the person who, is the cause of all these issues. So they start with their inner self. There's no magic wand. Start internally, look deep, look hard, ask yourself those hard questions. Then define what that means to you. What does diversity and inclusion? What does equity mean to you? What does it mean to you and your business? And then you have to put it on your scorecard. It has to become a hardcore KPI. And then you got to start driving the education, the business around you, and that takes courage, and I refer to Brene Brown again. You can choose courage or comfort, but you can't choose both. Comfort is where you just kind of sit back and be that leader. But the courageous leaders are the ones who are going to be asking this about themselves. Then you got to start looking critically at the structures in your business. What do those structures look like? And as I said, like D&I strategy often fails because it falls into these existing structures that haven't changed. You've got to create more tools, more awareness around equity. There's got to be huge amounts of self-awareness, not only for you, but your board level and the executive leadership around you. And then we've got to start creating spaces for people to thrive. And these topics have been touched on by everybody already. I still believe that this is not a standing point in the boardroom agenda. This is not a standing, agenda point where we have to talk about this hard at board level. And then again, the most important thing is, at a high level is for leaders to start leading by example, let them step up into that arena and start leading, so that these diversity and inclusion initiatives don't fail.
Great, thanks for that. Andrew, I want to bring you in here. Could you share some of the strategies you've used in order to create that internal environment where that safe environment where people are comfortable sharing their thoughts, their feelings, like that safe place?
Yeah, so just to expand on what everybody on the panel has said is that it really starts from the top. And communication is paramount to our regional president, Beth Bowen, and to our country manager, Carrie Ann McMullen. Our goal is really to create a supportive industry where the employers, the employees, and candidates, contractors are all engaged in dismantling the inequities through facilitating guidance, dialogue, education, teamwork, and innovative best practices. In fact, today at 12, shameless plug, we're having a virtual webinar, and they will discuss how the mining industry is actually responding to the DEI demands, because it's heavily weighted on the male gender versus the female gender, and how DEI can contribute to the financial and the operational success of the organization through leadership in the organization. So my first response is that we have the support from our senior executive team. And so when you have that, it motivates others and it encourages others to have those conversations where they feel safe. We're revisiting our HR policies to ensure that a DEI is reflective. And we also have intranet called Connect. And it's a space where people can access information. We are celebrating the achievements and successes that we've had as individuals and as a team. And, during COVID, we're making our intention to get to know each other better on a personal level. So, at the beginning of the conversation, Roy had mentioned inviting people into your household. And that's what we're doing. We're trying to create that environment where people are feeling comfortable and they're seeing a side of each other that they haven't experienced before. So in terms of our communication strategy and creating a safe place, those are some of the activities that we're doing right now.
Brilliant. And Carolyn, Roy, Chris, anybody have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to kind of bring in the concept of culture as well around, I've always seen culture as the great diluter of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because often cultures are embedded. They've embedded and things don't change, and you get that this is the culture around here, that kind of concept. And I've had the privilege of working with a guy out of San Francisco, a guy called Stan Slap, a very well-known author in the genre of culture. And, we talk about how culture can foster this kind of, this change. And, he often talks about, cultures don't really change. They've got to be convinced to change. And we've got to show at a high level, and this comes from leadership, there's that business case. We've talked about that business case. You can Google and you will get millions and millions of pages of the business case. But I still believe, to Chris's point earlier, we have to link that human case. And when we link that human case to diversity, and we can convince organizational cultures, that this is the better way forward, I think that will also speed up things, and that'll also embed the change leadership needs to bring. I think he's got a quote in his book somewhere where it goes, it's not the responsibility of your culture to understand the business logic. It is the responsibility of the business to understand the culture's logic. Businesses and leadership need to get into the culture's mind to be able to change D&I and convince them about how good this is. I'd love to hear other people's views on culture and how I see it as the big, diluter.
And maybe to Suki, to pull it, I want to go into that, pull it up into the executive discussions, because I'm so passionate about that side, and I spend a lot of my time there talking to executive teams, because I'll come in, I'll speak to a panel of a certain group of executives, and still they fill out a survey. Some individuals filling out a survey, let's not put they as a category, but they're still responding to say, I'm not dropping my standards to attract the marginalized communities. That's sitting at the executive level right now on a weekly basis. This isn't something that's, that doesn't happen now. Look at everything that happened in 2020. It does. So go back to the important on the executive and go to our industry. So I'll speak to Randstad. If you look at our executive team, you see opportunity, right? We see opportunity. But here's this comment, and I love that, sit down before you need to stand up. The executive group, so there's 13 people that are in the executive suite at Randstad, are going through a partnership with CCDI to unlearn, for with coaching, with guided coaching, to get uncomfortable. And this executive group is 100% committed to driving change, to understand what they don't know, to be vulnerable, to step up and learn, to be an ally, that we're on that journey. So they have that starting. Then the next thing is we're moving into allyships. We have wonderful partnerships with marginalized communities where each executive is then tagged to where they feel the most uncomfortable in their learning journey, to go sit down, listen and hear and empathize, so that they can come back and then understand with a different lens what that marginalized community is about. Lastly, how we're ending it this year, and these are phases that are happening this year. If you see, I'm talking about an annual approach, not something that's like it came up at an executive retreat or a meeting and then bam, we're making the decision and moving forward, which happens in our industry, right? Staffing moves fast. The end of this year is that every member of the CLT or a senior leadership group will be sponsoring a member of the BIPOC community or women into leadership and into the leadership pipeline. And remember the difference between sponsoring and mentorship. Sponsoring is that they're paving the way to move up in their career. And out of this year, in understanding ourselves, understanding our complexion, we're bringing the accountability into the company through diverse slates. So every leader, not just the executive group, will have a slate that reflects the team that they have and what their commitments are to move towards gender equity and have marginalized representation at least be at 30% in our leadership and our leadership pipeline. So the fact that the executive group has come to that spot gives me the feeling and empowerment to actually drive the change within the company. If I did not have that support from that group, that's big red flags. And it's very difficult to move if the executive group is truly not on. And this is the final point I want to make in that is going to that culture piece, Roy, right? Like the employees have an opportunity right now, more so than they ever had in the past, to be heard. So remember your voice. If you do not understand the D&I strategy at your company, ask about it. Ask how, if you're a member of the marginalized community, how am I included in this? What's been done to support me, right? Make sure as an organization there's employee-run groups. That's often by someone putting their hand up and saying, hey, I want to start an affinity group around Indigenous, around Latino. We have a number of them at Randstad Canada, and we learn from what our affinity groups tell us, right? Especially like the LGBTQ+, as we go through Pride Month. They give us feedback about how we are handling it and what else we could do to be more inclusive. So I just want to reiterate that point at the executive, and don't wait for the executive to turn. Help the executive in your organization turn by using your voice, because it's valuable and you will be heard.
It's really interesting because the question I had for you, you've kind of touched on it. Earlier on, I'd mentioned the feedback I got from the poll. And in particular, people's fears around even voting because they were fearful that somehow they'll get victimized. So my question was, what would you say to them? And then I was going to ask you in particular to talk about some of the uncomfortable conversations you've had internally and externally.
Yeah, and thank you for asking that. And the first thing, if you didn't feel comfortable to vote or expand on anything, that's your flag right there. So use that as I need to start with myself. And you've heard it repeated on the panel today. Go back with yourself. A very powerful reading for me. I don't know the exact title, but it's Unpacking the Privilege Backpack. And there's an article that's there that walks you through, and it was incredibly impactful for me because it asked all these questions about the privilege that I have had that I have not seen, and not realized that hasn't been something that someone else has. So I just use it as a red flag that you didn't do it. So not that, there's anything that you might need to say for the moment, or, you should feel safe. There's not a lot of safety around this yet. Let's call that a spade, right? It is what it is. We need to increase the safety, but the indicator that individuals didn't respond to the survey or aren't necessarily comfortable is that it's still there. And I get that. We just shared the fact that there's, executive teams that aren't hiring the way that they should be yet, which is okay. We're just progressing, right?
Yeah, I just want to add in there that some of those conversations were absolutely the white privilege, but I actually spoke to people of color who also felt uncomfortable. So I want to make sure everybody understands that we're not just, it wasn't just one particular group that felt uncomfortable, to the extent that I had somebody ring me up who was really unhappy with how their company was dealing with, well, they weren't dealing, it wasn't even a topic happening. And this is a very large company here in Canada. So I just want to put that out there, that it was quite a diverse group of people that actually felt uncomfortable.
Yeah, and it's about not singling yourself out too. That's a lot of feedback that we've had. It's like, I'm not going to raise my voice because what if? So you're absolutely right. It spans across. And I got to tell you, for the uncomfortable conversation piece, I'm okay being uncomfortable. I'll use another visual for you. Lobster, the little creek crustacean in the sea, when they grow, they start to feel uncomfortable because their shell doesn't actually expand. So think of this delicious, meaty lobster in the ocean, doesn't grow because its shell won't grow with it. It shoots out the back of its shell and hides under a rock while it builds another shell. So talk about the like impactful, I'm completely vulnerable while I'm going, lobster image in your head. It's most of the conversations right now can feel uncomfortable, but and that's okay. So I think almost every conversation I have is uncomfortable for someone in the conversation, but it's recognizing that you're feeling that way, creating a safe space and saying it up front, right? Now, how are you feeling in this? We're here together. We're here to listen. There's no judgment. And like I said, most of the conversations do feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I just want to add one piece there. I've spoken to, as you know, I recruit globally, and I've spoken to some amazing white leaders, male and female, who they are so inclusive. I see it through the hiring process, right? So they hire the best person for the job and all the rest of it. And when I have seen them speak up in other groups, people have automatically just gone to attack. What do you know? So I think I also want to put out there, if somebody is putting themselves out there and standing up for what they're believing and actually saying, look, I practice this, let's just give them that space and compassion and acknowledge that. I guess what I'm saying is not every white person discriminates. Not every Indian is this or Chinese is this. We collectively have to allow those individuals that are trying to speak up. We got to give them the opportunity and we have to listen. So that was the only other piece I would add to that, unless somebody else has got something to add to that.
I just want to share that, sometimes the consequences might not, result in the way that you'd like them to manifest. But my personal experience with my current employer is that I was very upset during the situation with George Floyd. And I saw a lot of, support from pharmaceutical companies about the situation. And we were silent. And so I asked my immediate, my boss, I'm like, can we post something? And the response was like, we have to go through global to ensure that's a possibility. And it was crickets, And then I got a call one day, and it's because of the leadership that we have regionally that said, Ange, yes, we need to do something about this. We need to be engaged. We need to support the community. And that's how our division of diversity, equity, and inclusion came about. So, having that voice and being brave, for a lack of a better term, is okay, because it could result in something that's positive.
Yeah, I would, Angelina, thanks so much for sharing that. I would echo those sentiments wholeheartedly. And for the sake of role modeling, I'll be a little bit vulnerable. And we must have some synergy, because I'm right with you. Last year during the George Floyd incident and the Amy Cooper and the social justice and unrest that pursued, I wrote a LinkedIn letter that was just an open letter that was pretty raw and direct and personal. And I had some fear about writing the letter, and I was working as a practitioner in this space. And so, Suki, to your point, I think it goes all ways. This is not just a conversation about discomfort and leaning in for the majority group. And I had to have some reflection on myself and think about the role I play in terms of progress and leaning in and driving awareness and understanding. And it was, to Angelina's point, very, very well received by our leadership, by folks in the community, and actually taught me quite a bit about, what I want to take from, my family, the folks who have shaped my perspective and my lens, and what I need to put down and push through as we move into this newer and bolder and more vulnerable world. So again, I would agree. I would encourage folks to do that. The outcome may not always be positive, but that tension is what we need to have those heart shifts and those mind shifts to move forward.
Thank you. Does anybody have anything to add to that before I move on to my final question? Okay, so let me move on. Ange, how do you see DI practices evolving over the next 5-10 years?
Good question. I don't think we can truly predict the true impact of any human capital effort. However, one thing that remains a constant variable throughout all of this is our collective efforts to create sustainable, inclusive cultures, and is the most relevant work we can do. We cannot let those who have been marginalized or underrepresented or other to be pushed further into the shadows of non-essential. Our job is to continue to create that visibility and to amplify the voices, and having platforms like this today, people representing communities like Carolyn and Chris and Roy, yourself, myself, is going to be imperative. So in response to your question, I don't really have the answer, but if we continue with this dialogue and ensuring that the awareness remains forefront, I think that it could potentially evolve. My only concern would be artificial intelligence, and we know that a lot of jobs are going to be replaced, but how do we maintain this momentum? And I think it's just by continuing with doing things like what what we're doing today.
Thank you. And Carolyn, what about yourself? How do you see it evolving?
I think the great thing coming out of the pandemic and everything that's happened is the new ways of work. And we're seeing, why I say that is because we're seeing now procurement practices change with the D&I lens. We're seeing RFPs change with the D&I lens. We're seeing some companies step up and like where they're using their voice or how they're explaining what their journeys are. We're seeing so many more communities, startups coming into this space to help people move and companies move. We see the government of Canada, working with the 50-30 challenge that they created. So I think that the foundation has never been stronger. But the problem here is we don't want history to repeat itself, that it starts and then drops and starts and then drops. So hopefully now some of the pillars within the community and the responsibility of the private sector starts to lean in. And honestly, I really have it as a call to action to our industry. It doesn't matter that we're sitting here as competitors. We need to sit together for the strength of this industry, because our industry is what's going to influence all industries. So if we just focus on ourselves as a collective, again, our impact is just going to be compounding.
And Roy, yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the fastest shift in workplace strategies in the last 50 years. And when I talk about workplace strategies, I'm talking about, human capital, human resources, physical buildings are going to change. The way we innovate will change. Our cultures are all changing. So I think it's a great leveler to actually start getting these kind of practices in line and much more efficient. And I think it's going to create a great platform to go forward. My concern is if we look at gender mainstreaming across the world, it is still very slow. Things are not happening fast enough. And I do believe, to Carolyn's point, we need to, as collective competitors, work in a collaborative kind of economy to really start making this, a huge factor. And I think it is my hope that companies are starting to see the benefit of being purpose-driven, and purpose-driven companies can include DE&I into their strategies at the top level that are core to their business. But not only the core to the business case of DE&I, but linking that human case. I mean, let's kind of be honest. Humanity is all over the show at the moment. We are not doing well, and I think we can really pull this together. So I think the next couple of years are going to be exciting times, and I think there's going to be a lot of progress made. But it's definitely up to not only people like ourselves, but other industries to really take this forward. And I'm also like you, Carolyn. I love a little quote, and Mahatma Gandhi is very close to our hearts in South Africa. He lived here and he worked here as a human rights lawyer in his early days before going back to India. And he has a quote where it says, "Our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization." And if we get it right, it will be the beauty, but it is the big test of our civilization today. And we need to focus on getting that right in the next 5 to 10 years.
And Chris, yourself, what do you see the future?
Well, very eloquently said. I think from everyone, I agree. I think that this is going to become commonplace in kind of the lexicon of our lives, and that these structures that divide us are increasingly being dismantled. And so it will be an imperative for us to solve this challenge of how to live together, how to coexist, and more importantly, flourish together as one. I completely agree with the collaboration piece of it. I have seen some of the silos that have traditionally been in place, industry to industry, start to crumble, and there's starting to be quite a bit more collaboration. I think some of that is tied to the fact that some of these systemic challenges go outside of the walls of our organizations and industries. So if you think about education, you think about healthcare, access to wealth, there's some of these bigger issues that I think there's an awakening and awareness that there's going to be a need for a collaboration across sectors, or even within sectors with direct competitors, to address some of these for the greater good as well. So again, I'm an optimist and hope for progress, but it will be a intense process. And I'll leave with a quote as well. Roy, I tend to have a mentor that I read and research from time to time. And right now, I've been doing quite a bit of research on Mandela, and he has a concept known as Ubuntu. If I'm saying that correctly, which I think is so beautiful, and it's the profound sense that we are human only through the humanity of others. That if we are to accomplish anything in this world, it will in equal measure be due to the work and achievements of others. And, fully agree with that. Part of what drives me and motivates me every day to have these conversations.
Wow.
Powerful.
Yeah, they're really powerful quotes to end on. I mean, the reality is, as an industry, we need to change before we're forced to change. Some countries have legislation around it. Places like Canada, let's not let the government into our business. I don't want the government any more in my business than they are. And the only way to prevent that is if we self-manage, self-regulate, and things like that. And I think companies over the next year or two, I think, as a staffing industry, I think companies got to take a look at their leadership teams. They've got to take a look at that leadership team and say, is this the person to drive the change? And I'm not talking profit. I'm not talking about, is this the person to drive the change? Because here's the thing, if we don't drive that change doesn't happen. Your clients are going to be looking for the change, and they're going to partner with the company that is truly living, breathing, practicing. And from my own personal perspective, this is a subject that's really, really dear to me. For those of you that don't know, although I'm born in England, my background is Indian, and I have 3 children, and I want to leave a better world for them because my daughter is married to a Canadian Chinese. My son is engaged to a Canadian Scottish girl. So my grandchildren, whenever they are going to be what my husband and I say United Nations. And I want them to be able to have a world, grow up in a world where they're able to see the beauty in each other's cultures and not have to say, well, I'm only one culture. I want them to be able to see the world through the beautiful lens of the whole world, not just the Indian lens or the Chinese or the Canadian, whatever the case may be. So guys, on that note, thank you ever so much for taking the time out today. I really appreciate this. Now, quickly, if anybody wants to reach out and talk to you about anything that you've spoken about, what's the best way for them to get hold of you?
Go through LinkedIn for me would be awesome. Happy to help in any way.
Ange?
Same for me. LinkedIn.
Roy?
LinkedIn, just ping me on LinkedIn. I'm happily to get involved in discussions.
And also our clubhouse, Suki, on Thursday.
Yes, thank you. Thursday mornings, 8 a.m. Eastern. We have been hosting a weekly clubhouse, and what we are talking about is exactly this topic and our industry, the changes. So if you're on Clubhouse, I know it's only for iPhone at the moment. If you're on iPhone and you need an invite, let me know. Between us, we'll make sure you've got an invite. Join the conversation there. Quickly, before I go, just got a LinkedIn user has just given, here you go.
Don't forget to ask Chris how he can be reached.
Sorry, Chris.
No, LinkedIn as well works perfect. Welcome the opportunity to connect with individuals and corporations to have this important dialogue. So
I wasn't excluding you.
Yeah, DEI, good one.
Appreciate it.
But I quickly want to put up the LinkedIn user's comment because that's somebody's opinion on where they see the next 5 to 10 years, right? We should focus on every day what we can do, how we can make a difference at work, educating our team members, promoting within our prospects and clients, intern at home with our groups of friends, family, becoming a promoter rather than a supporter. Yeah, I mean, that's a brilliant way to end. Totally. We all got to be part of this conversation. As I said when we started earlier on, the only way we're going to do this if we listen to everybody's voice. We allow other people to talk openly, talk about their fears, their concerns, their experiences. Only then can we learn. So on that note, guys, thank you ever so much for your time. I Truly appreciate you taking the time out. And I look forward to potentially doing another panel. Thanks ever so much, guys. Bye for now.
Bye.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.